So hi, my name is Mark Florance. I'm the co-chair of BritCham's Energy and Utilities Committee. I'm also I also work for a company or a fund called Climate Investor One, which invests in renewable energy around the region in Asia. Today, we are just having a quick roundup from the members of BritCham's Energy Utilities Committee to look at really the main reflections from our committee members on what happened at the COP26, but also some of the consequences for our members, particularly here in Asia. But before we do that, we'll start with David Kelly from the British Chamber of Commerce, who's the president. He'll give his reflections.
Thanks, Mark. So sustainability has been woven into the Chamber's 5 core themes for more than 2 years now. And with our campaign called the Road to Net Zero, the plan was to support businesses large and small with content to support them on their journey to reduce emissions and to provide a world or help create a sustainable world that we all want to live in and do business in. And it was pleasing to see from the output from COP26 a real push for that Road to Net Zero target. And the question from us as a chamber is, what does that mean for business? And how can we support businesses to really get on board with that journey? We, of course, have gone carbon neutral about 2 years ago. So we have looked at our plan as an organisation, as a small business more broadly, to really champion this going forwards. And I think what we need to sort of really think about as a chamber are, from the extensive engagement with countries, what were those priorities looking like? What were the rules around transparent reporting? What was the ambition around carbon markets? What about those common timeframes and frameworks that we can support with, both here in Singapore, but also through the chambers more broadly around the region in Asean through the Britain in Southeast Asia network? And so we have got some great plans in place. We've got committees which are driving a sustainable conversation through all of our activities as a Chamber of Commerce. And it's about building on that. And it's about ensuring that we're having the right conversation at the right level, both across the UK government regionally here, but also with the Singapore government too. And one of the things that, from the back of COP26, we've just launched our ICAEW and BritCham report on green finance and looking at what that sustainable trade financing piece looks like across the value chain, around how talent and discrepancies in climate finance standards need to develop to standardise audit standards going forwards, and the role that professional bodies play to develop effective policy and standards regionally and to collaborate in terms of upskilling of talent more broadly. So I think the position that the Chamber of Commerce plays is, how do we ensure that we have these really powerful impactful conversations? How do we ensure that our counterparts around the region are being plugged into this? How do we share the experience here in Singapore and play those back to chambers across the region? And how does this fit with the overall post-COP26 agenda, but also the UK's ambition to take these conversations forward? So, Mark, really exciting time for us. And I think we play a really important part in terms of supporting that agenda into the future.
Thank you, David. And I think, BritCham, I think, has done, well, particularly in Singapore, has done a fantastic job at both the sustainability and really the whole energy side of things. I mean, they've been very active and so very supportive of us as a committee as well. So thank you. I just should probably give my quick reflections on what I thought of the COP26. And very briefly, I think it's worthwhile saying that I was very encouraged by what happened. But clearly, there's a lot of work to be done. And I think it's also very encouraging that there is obligations for people to come back in 12 months with refined, basically what their set goals are, but to define them further. And that's fantastic. But there's obviously a few countries that were dragged along in the process, and they're just trying to a certain extent, I guess, cater their own electorates. But they'll, I think, will be forced by commercial means, if nothing else, to move forward. Next, we'll get some thoughts from Tim Rockell. Tim is our chairman of the Energy Utilities Committee. Over to you, Tim.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mark, and thanks, David, for those initial comments. My name's Tim. I'm a consultant for KPMG, and I have my own advisory business looking at innovation and technology in the sector. I was rather pleased by COP26. I thought it all went rather well. There might be areas that people didn't like and some of the language that was changed at the end, but I think that the overall direction was positive. And I think there was also a reflection that this is a slightly longer game than people might have been talking about a few years ago. But as we went through COP, I was pleased to see that 90% of the world's economy is now covered by net zero targets. We might not like where those targets are, we might like them to be sooner, but I think that's progress, and that's something really to kind of hang a lot of our work for next year on. As we were going through COP, as different announcements were being made, whether it's around forestation or motor vehicles, policies around standards and reporting that were made, I was ticking off a number of the things that we've done in our Energy and Utilities Business Committee, alongside some of the other committees. We've done a lot of work with the sustainability, with the transportation, with the Built Environment Committee, looking at some of these areas. And I was pleased to kind of put ticks alongside some of those areas, but also reflect upon what we need to do in 2022. I was actually surprised, and my own knowledge probably lacking. I didn't realize that the UK remains president of COP until COP 28, which is being held in Egypt. So a lot of work to be done. And as BritCham Energy and Utilities, we're very pleased to do that in alignment with the British High Commission. One of the things that I was pleased about was there was no real surprises coming out of Asean, out of Southeast Asia. And I think, kudos to the team, Tom and Kaho and everyone at the High Commission who really put efforts in around the region. And I think that's something that I'd like to do as well for 2022, is really bring some of the other energy and utilities business committees together across the region as we look at some of these areas, as we have done in 2021 on areas of hydrogen, carbon capture, sustainable infrastructure. So I'll leave it there because I know the committee's got lots to say, and hand over to the next person. So back to you, Mark.
Good, thanks, Tim. I think picking up on one of your points, I think it is really, I'm using the word again, encouraging that ASEAN has stepped up. So as a group, I think ASEAN has done quite a good job here and has surprisingly stepped up much more than people expected them to. So that, and Singapore in particular, I think. Next, I'll hand over to Peter Godfrey for your views.
Hi, my name's Peter. I head up the Energy Institute in the region. I've been on the committee for a while, and obviously I represent the energy sector in the broader sense of the word. So looking at the oil and gas industry, renewables, how those connect together as we move through the energy transition and our pathways to net zero. So as I was saying, and really following on from Tim's comments, I too would suggest that COP26 was a success. There were areas, obviously, that were a shortfall as far as a lot of people were concerned. Obviously, the issue of climate justice and how one creates an equitable transition when it comes to pathways to net zero still needs a lot of working out as we move forwards. But generally, I think there is a positive atmosphere about moving forwards with a net zero agenda generally. As we move to the region, I think, and back to this issue of justness, let's recognize firstly that the issue now is that money is available, and that was very clear in COP26, that the private community and private organizations are ready to invest. The problem is that within the energy infrastructure sustainability space, a lot of that investment has to be put into public infrastructure, and particularly here in Asia, a lot of that infrastructure that needs to be invested in is publicly owned, not privately owned. So the issue of how you link private investment with publicly owned infrastructure is clearly an issue that really comes to the fore in terms of structure and where we need to go from here. Now, to me, there are three fundamental physical building blocks. One of the physical building blocks, technology, the ability to scale those technologies up in a way that makes sense both from the investor standpoint of view as well as from a sustainable infrastructure point of view. The second one, where I think not enough has been achieved yet, are on the economic and societal adjustments that are required in the way of policy to actually enable that scaling up in a way that can be dealt with at scale, but also from the point of view of unifying regions and unifying those areas together. And that, of course, requires governance. it requires institutional commitment, and it requires standards and policies to put in place that make sense. Now, for me, the real question when it comes to net zero is, can that be achieved, number one, on a global basis, or does it need to be done on a regional basis? And more importantly, can it be done across sector or more on a sectoral focus? So a need now to focus much more on sector commitments for net zero agendas going forwards. To me, that's where we need to follow up. We need to be much more sector focused. We need to create sector-based regulators that begin to start putting the rules of the game so that we can scale up technologies and create those economic and societal adjustments that we want to see happen over the next decade or two as we transition. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Peter. And I think it's a good point you made about the sectorial focus, because that didn't really come out in most of the discussions, most of the, I guess, the press reporting post COP26. So I think that's something worth following up on and focusing on. Right, next up is Nick Dingemans.
Thanks, Mark. I'm Nick Dingemans. I'm a partner in Pennington's Manches Cooper, and I work in corporate energy infrastructure space. My main takeaway was with regard to the Article 6 rules being put in place finally. I think that's a major milestone. They're slightly confusing in the way that they're put in place, but what it allows at least is each jurisdiction and each region to decide how they will implement those rules and then sign up to the supervisory board. So there's a transition period from now through to about 2025. We've got some grandfathering in of the Kyoto Protocol CERs, but not too many. So we may see a flood, but initially, but at least there's a transition. Whether or not that's a just transition or not, it's not clear. But I think for this region in particular, and Singapore's stewardship of getting Article 6 through at COP, I think that puts Singapore in a very strong position. And I think the potential for a regional carbon market based out of Singapore, or even a global carbon market based out of Singapore, is now very strong. And I think that's the big exciting thing for me. It's going to take some work over the next few years, but when we then turn to financing options for sustainability and net zero, if you can be rewarded for investing in mitigation outcomes, I think that then changes the equation. And helps the acceleration to net zero. So that's my main takeaway.
Thanks, Nick. And as always, I think ultimately this will be all commercially driven. Yeah. Without a commercial nexus to it, I think it'd be quite hard to really reach net zero. But I'm pretty sure that as long as the right policies are put in place and there's that drive, I'm sure that the sustainable funds, and I'm part of that, will come and follow.
Yeah, and look, I advise investors in this space as well, and you know, it's clear it will follow and it will just accelerate.
Great, thanks, Nick. I'm turning over now to Thomas Briault.
Hi, yeah, thanks, Thomas Briault from Arup. For me, COP had kind of two key takeaways. Firstly, although the wording and the watering down of the wording on coal may have disappointed some, actually it signifies, in my mind, a very significant shift. We'd already seen China announce that it wasn't going to fund coal internationally. I think China and India will continue to build coal-fired power station, but I think everyone else will find it very, very difficult to finance any new coal-fired generation, and I think that really does put a death knell in coal. And although there are a few markets that still want to sell coal, I just can't see that changing, and over time we're going to see that disappear. And I think it's going to be very quick. So it'll be a very brave investment now to be investing in coal. Secondly, and I come back to what Nick said, I think Article 6 really does build a framework that the world can get behind. I think, you know, unilateral agreements with 197 countries into the fine detail of carbon markets is unlikely. But as Nick pointed out, the wording can be done regionally or even on a country basis. I think the European Carbon Border Mechanism presents a real starting point that, maybe the UK wants to join, then the US wants to join. Before you know it, anyone that wants to trade with Europe is going to have to set up their own thing. We've already seen a mechanism in China lay the ground for that market, even if it isn't quite there yet. And so I feel like that starts a carbon market that really changes the economics of investment. And at that point, we're going to see various different countries change the way the market works for investment in low carbon solutions. So, we can't let the lack of a universal agreement on this be a reason for inaction. We must continue to do what we can do to push our legislators and keep up momentum. And you can see this is ever going to tighten. So for me, it was a pretty good outcome out of COP. Maybe not the best that you could imagine, but I can see that the direction of travel is a positive one.
Thanks, Thomas. I think it's an interesting point about the carbon market. I think some people would argue a carbon market is the silver bullet, because once carbon is properly priced, then people will actually then use other means of energy and sustainability. Right, moving on. I think Paul, you're next. Paul O'Keefe.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, my name is Paul O'Keefe. I work for Aeon, and obviously energy transition is a lot about change and risk and volatility, which Aeon is all about. But I want to really talk about the insurance industry generally. Mark Carney, the special envoy to the United Nations, he said that by insuring and investing with foresight, the insurance industry really has the opportunity to break the tragedy of the horizon. And perhaps because it was held in the UK, many would argue the home of insurance, if we go back to the Lloyd's coffee shop, I think COP26 saw engagement from the insurance industry in a way that none of the COPs previously have. And I think that whilst the insurance industry is obviously feeling its way with its clients, corporations, I think you're now going to see a lot more innovation and a lot more engagement by that industry into thinking about its own investments and thinking about how it works with its insurance portfolio to try and make these things come together. So yeah, I think from my perspective, COP26 was a valuable forum for the insurance industry this time around.
Presumably, Paul, I guess a lot of the things that are going to potentially be stranded assets like coal stations and so on in the future, insurance will be more and more difficult for these guys. So that'll be another factor they need to consider in their long-term plans.
Yes, Mark, I think as an industry, we recognize that the how right now is not really coming forward. So I think people will think about how do we promote energy transition? How do we help clients accelerate that as an industry? And there are, I think, you'll start to see some things coming out, I think, from the likes of Aeon on that.
Great. Thanks, Paul. Kaho, you.
This is Kaho Yu from Verisk Maplecroft. We are a risk consultancy looking at the ESG and political risk. I would like to share a few observations of the COP26. The inclusion of language around the fossil fuel is very significant, and it somehow kick off the start of the end of the coal. But more on the risk side, which is the investor need to pay attention to, especially when they're investing in the APEC region, is that we are expecting to see the global division on climate action between developed countries and developing countries to continue to deepen over the next decade. So due to the limited energy options, some countries will likely take a much slower transition path than the US or the EU or the UK. And we expect some emerging markets or the cash-strapped economies, kind of including those in Southeast Asia, to call for more balancing act or climate justice in the upcoming energy transition path or even in the COP27. And this means that a lot of associated environmental risk in this region will unlikely, they will remain, although they are not going to deter the investment in the region. But the significant gap between climate leaders and some of these developing countries are exposing international firms and investors to some risk here. First, it will likely place the investment in, let's say, China, India, or other developing countries with a slower pace under tightened kind of scrutiny, especially for the carbon intensive projects, because they are facing higher kind of stakeholder and regulatory pressure for ESG reporting at home. And secondly, even though some of these developing countries have a slower pace or they have their own concerns, but this does not mean that they are going to follow this forever. In future, whenever they have to meet the climate target, they may suddenly change the policy again. And this is going to expose a lot of the investor into kind of a certain regulatory disruption. So these are the a few observations of mine, but in overall speaking, we do see that a change of direction, a clear change of direction in the COP26 for energy transition. Thank you.
Mr. Kaho. Yeah, you're right. Investors will lead a lot of this as well. So investors won't obviously invest in things that don't make sense going forward. And I think that'll start at the retail level all the way through. Retail investors into funds won't want to invest in things they feel don't make sense for the climate policies. That the fund managers won't invest in companies, and the companies will have high cost of capital, etc. So that's quite an important point you make. So, well, thank you very much for all your I think very useful insights.